It's finally that time. I was instructed to wait out on a street corner last night where 3 men, women, people threw a bag over my head and bundled me into the back of a van, so this is the first time I'm seeing the site of the new zoo. I'm seeing a lot of African animals on the wall though, and a big hot sun. That's got to be a good sign. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our newest zoo location in the beautiful mountains of Norway. We will be working to establish our first real conservation zoo here in the Trondheim National Park. A place that I made up because most places in Norway have Norwegian names, would you guess? And I would not feel comfortable trying to pronounce them on a regular basis, so we'll go with something a bit simpler. Our work over at the reserve gained us a little bit of attention, mostly in the neighbouring countries though. A local wildlife centre will only get you so far, it seems. And this here was the most exciting opportunity on the table. It also doesn't hurt that thanks to the chilly climate, this only had a handful of applicants. Regardless, we're here now. We've been given a modest starting capital and asked to perform miracles with it, so we'd better get to work. We currently have 4 species being held temporarily at other locations nearby, so we need to hit the ground running. One of the benefits of this being a publicly owned enterprise is that we don't have to buy most of our own animals. Not cash value anyway. I may still need to use my influence to secure some rarer species or higher quality individuals. But thankfully, where influence can be used, it can also be gained, so it's no real issue. The first of these 4 species is the European moose. As one of my favourite types of animals in the Highland Reserve, it makes sense that we would open the Trondheim Park with the kings and queens of the deer. Now, starting with an animal this size means we can't just throw a small display pen together for a quick income. You know, like we did with the pigs and the chickens in the reserve. No. Despite our small investment fund, we need to make a statement. Something people will come from all over the world to see. So, we should probably get into it, shouldn't we? Our first issue is the terrain. This is no flat farmland primed and ready to build on. I want to try and work as much as possible with the terrain and incorporate it rather than just levelling mountains here. This enclosure I actually planned and drew out before starting, and the map provided an almost perfect area to work with. I had to level off an area to build the barn, but it will become very clear that this has been built and formed unnaturally by the time we're done. The rest of the habitat sort of drops down in stages, with a small, picturesque stream running through the centre. The lake at the bottom I have a couple of ideas for, but for now it's just scenery really. I'm trying to take this zoo habitat by habitat and let the landscape guide the shape and direction that we take. So, after today, well, your guess is as good as mine as to how this will end up. The guest viewing is also the entrance in a way. In order to get to the main part of the zoo, the guests will have to walk along a long, relatively narrow bridge with a great view into the moose forest enclosure. By the way, when I said in the last video that this was going to be huge, I wasn't lying. I think this habitat was around 5,000 square meters on the gate, which is enormous. Granted, with the full decoration, I think that was around 1,000 meters that the moose could navigate, but you still feel that scale as a guest. The design of the barn and the positioning on that plateau is taken roughly from a reference. I'm sure if you Google Norway barn, you'll see what I'm talking about. Using this reference was actually really helpful. I would normally go by feel, but planning this enclosure out a bit has really given me a new perspective on building. I've tried to keep as much as possible in the video to show what I did, but you may notice this video is almost 40 minutes long. I had just over 11 hours of gameplay for this one enclosure to edit down. Admittedly, some of that was waiting for money to come back up so that I could continue working, but a lot of it was detailing. So you can probably imagine it was tough to try and achieve the 20-minute video that I was targeting in the Highland Reserve. Hopefully that would come down a bit moving forward, but based on what I've built already for next week, I wouldn't count on it just yet. Hopefully I've kept enough to see what I've done while also keeping the pace up. I've kept it maybe 20% of the rock work and foliage, because that's essentially the same thing over and over again. I suppose before we get to that, I should talk a little bit about this barn. You may have noticed I started with a black plaster wall. I toyed with the idea of using it as an interior lining to keep the warmth in, but it was a bit thick and you lost some of the authentic feel on the inside. I still needed something behind the wooden slats though to hide the gaps. So I double layered the wall and offset them slightly so it had mildly better insulation. These buildings also have very small windows, which is probably another way of trying to keep as much heat in as possible. If you do find the reference, you'll see these windows are actually very accurate in scale, which I'm very happy about. One thing that I couldn't see from the picture was the front or back doors, so I had to do a bit of guesswork, but what I came up with is very much in keeping with the design of the building. Or at least, I think so. There may be some architects who disagree. I did my best, and that's what counts. I find that it's more difficult to build small scale things like these windows. The shortest pieces I could find are still slightly too long for the space that I left. I had to work in a bit of a design that would account for that. You'll see what I mean with the basic frame, everything's ever so slightly too long. That's one thing I've seen in Planet Coaster, I think. And perhaps Prehistoric Kingdom. I haven't played much of either, so I wouldn't say for definite, but they have the scalable pieces, so you can adjust the size as you need. I feel like that would be a really useful addition here. Like I say, I did end up working out a way to make the windows look good still, so there's no problem. They also have an interior side, which I don't think I've shown, but it's similar to the outside, but with a bit more of a windowsill. Nothing too fancy, just something to finish it off a bit. This series is going to be less about what animals are in the local area, and more about what animals are most suited to the climate. There's a relatively short list of species that could survive comfortably in the freezing north. As an aside, there doesn't seem to be anywhere in Norway that is more balanced. It all seems to be Arctic, which is a shame because there are some amazing landscapes in Norway that aren't, white 90% of the time. But the game giveth, and the game taketh away scenery. This zoo is kind of a trial by fire situation, in that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. There's no better test of environmental pressure. Not necessarily for the animals, they're well suited to the cold, but for the guests, building a successful zoo in a place like this is where the real challenge lies. And so far, my experience has been kind of tough. The only saving grace is that this zoo is still small enough that people will brave the cold for a short time. But I will need to get some heaters installed soon. This barn is another one of those buildings that doesn't look particularly detailed on first glance, but has a surprising amount of work in it. Now I worked on this over a couple of days, so I didn't realise fully how much until I collected all the recordings to edit. I think actually I had to take a break from the barn at one point to see if there were any trees about that I could move because I needed to do something different. Which is funny, in retrospect, knowing what's coming next week, but you'll have to wait and see for that one. On the grassland map we used for the Highland Reserve, there were a lot more trees that we could repurpose. Here there are a handful around the entrance, but that seems to be all. It's not a massive money saver, but early on it's a handy thing to use. I should say as well, the reserve was on medium difficulty and Trondheim is on hard. Don't know exactly what that will affect, probably animal satisfaction and revenue. I couldn't say I've noticed anything yet. Without getting too ahead of myself, just based on this enclosure and the one that I'm editing for episode 2, the building and design are so much better than anything I've done so far. Never mind the video quality improvement, this zoo is a large step up from where we started back in June. Makes me wonder what the next zoo will start off like. And there I go, getting too far ahead. Let's just stick with the moose for now. I know it's a bit of a longer video, but I think it's well worth it. And even if you're not the type to watch a speed build, although if you've made it to this point, you probably are. Even if you're not, I'd say just skip to the cinematics because this is a beautiful habitat, if I do say so myself. Make sure you stay to the very end as well for a little surprise. When I started making these videos, my biggest concern was trying to find something to talk about for 10 minutes. 10 minutes sounds like a dream right now. I'm going to talk about the doors. I know we're not quite there yet, but there's an awkward gap where I'm just relocating trees and I like how these doors work. There's the doors in the cowshed in the reserve too, now that I think about it. Thankfully I have something a little more exciting a bit later to show you, but right now it's the doors. I used the hinges for the first time. Not the big ones, although they would have been the right style. It wouldn't quite fit where I wanted them. The hinges that I did use look ever so slightly too small. If anything, they need to be longer to support the weight of the door, but there's only one that fits, so we'll go with that. There's also only one lock, and it's way too big. I had hoped there would be like a chain or some bolts, drawer bolts or padlocks, some kind for gates, but no. I ended up resorting to an old technique that has somewhat gone out of style in recent centuries. A wooden bar lock, like a castle barricade, although not as heavy duty. It actually looks surprisingly good. I have wondered how to lock both doors at the same time, but ultimately decided not to worry about that as it's not an eventuality that I will ever have to face. Also entirely possible that I just need to look properly through the building pieces and find some bits I can work with, but would it be so bad to have a couple of locks and chains available? What I did find useful was the decals. I know a lot of people use them already, but I've never tried them until now, and they did really help the barn look, a little older, more weathered, lived in by moose, I don't know, but certainly seen some use. Something that I skipped over in the last zoo was the guest buildings. Shops, restrooms, ATMs, anything that wasn't directly related to an enclosure. And sometimes that was by accident, but it was also because, it's not a part of the game that I enjoy as much. Building a habitat and then watching the animals explore and live in it. It's what this game is all about, really. And the guests are necessary, yes, but they're more difficult and more demanding than the animals most of the time. and also far less rewarding. Yes, they give us money, but I mean rewarding in the sense of satisfaction. Anyway, my point is, I didn't show any of the guest services. You know, it feels like a box checking exercise, in a way. I mean, I guess all of the mechanics in Planet Zoo are kind of a box checking exercise, but it's not as fun when it's just with people. I think, though, in this zoo, I need to put a little bit more effort into that area. So, at the moment, I'm recording those bits and collecting them in a separate folder. I'm going to put all those together at some point and put them on an occasional Wednesday. You know, my Planet Zoo series is best when it's around an animal, so my Friday episodes are going to stay as an enclosure. But I got my Wednesdays free at the moment. It's sort of a floating day between series. So anything extra that isn't animal related is going to go there. So you can find that whenever they become available. So I'm sort of doing it in between habitats. You know, when I get a bit bored or I just need a break from something, I record a little bit. So I'm doing it in stages. It's not as long. Thanks to the financial situation, I did reach a point where I had to put the build on hold for a while. You know, place down the necessary buildings and block off any escape points just to get the animals in and start making a bit of cash back. Once we had some income, I even took a 20 grand loan out and still ran out of that very quickly. I think there must be easily over 100 grand invested in this habitat alone. And I get it. You have to build up from nothing. That's the point of the franchise mode. But it would be nice to be able to scale your starting money based on, you know, the zoos that you already have or the amount of money that you've raised in recent zoos. Just as an option, you know. It's a bit late in the game for those sorts of changes. We can work around it, like we did here. All that means is it takes a bit longer to get started. I think by the time I finished this enclosure, we were on year 11 or 12, something like that. 12 years to build one habitat. Or more than that, actually. The zoo was open for a bit, for a lot of years, with only a partially made moose enclosure. Which would be tougher to explain narratively when we're supposed to have large investments, but I will figure that out when the time comes. I'm happy to say after enclosure 2 we are slightly better in terms of money. So by the time we have the first 4 species settled in, I'm hoping that we'll be past worrying or waiting for more money. As I mentioned, blocking off any escape points. I didn't want lots of fences for this habitat. I spoke about my love of natural barriers in the last zoo, and we didn't get to do any, so this episode needed to show what I mean. My first thought was to have a steep terrain act as the backdrop, and have, you know, dense woodland or forest coming down the sides and capping off each end, with the bridge along the bottom, the guest bridge along the bottom, acting as that lower barrier. And this was working perfectly. However, I didn't want to pack the trees so densely at all points. It works in the centre, but as you move to the edges of the woods, it becomes a little more sparse. So, I filled in some of these gaps with rocks. Of course, rocks are our greatest friend in this game. But my favourite barrier in this enclosure was actually the deadwood trees. Turns out if you tip a tree on its side, even animals that climb won't go near it. There's a little hint into next week. So, used a bit of grass and dense ferns to create a forest floor which fills in a bit of the area under the pines. We mostly use pines here. And then I hid some of those fallen trees beneath it, all as a block for the moose. Some I had visible, as it is a nice natural barrier, but there's a lot of it under there that's just functional rather than aesthetic. And I know, sure, real life, the moose would just walk over them, but this is a national park. Unless the animals are more dangerous predators, I don't see why they should be restricted. In reality, the whole area would be fenced off, You know, and rangers would be taking care of the animals over a much wider area. You know, that's not strictly the vibe that I'm going with for this zoo, but I am going to use it as a justification regardless. This little stream was a bit tricky. You may have spotted when I was making it, I was raising the edges up, creating a bit of a bowl. I know there's a way to get the water to the level you want, but I don't know it, and there was no middle ground between the too shallow and overflowing at the surface, at the level of the surface of the ground that's around it. So this was how I had to resolve that. I figured I'd be able to use rocks and cover it up where it looked particularly noticeable. And I did that. I did. But it seems the moose also don't like the rocks and are very cautious about where they will walk. Which is great for the barriers, as we've already said. Not so cool for them being able to step over the stream. Which doesn't seem like it would be an issue with those long legs. Thankfully the top area was the only part where I had to build a little bridge crossing, so didn't end up causing too many issues. Just had to leave certain areas a bit less rocky, a bit more open. I also used the water effects for the first time here, some of which are a bit aggressive for the stream, so I had to put them a little bit deeper than they were designed for, just to give the impression of direction of the water. I did also have some higher a bit later on once I'd added some of the detail, but at that point it was looking a bit more real, so it really added to the effect. I'm really happy with how it came out. The effects aren't perfect for this speed of water, but they definitely improve the atmosphere of the enclosure, so it's definitely a plus. Oh, I have to just say as well, as it was a point of frustration in the reserve, how nice it is to build for an animal with no coverage limit. What a delight. Even something subtle as using grass, at different heights to show where the animals have walked frequently, takes a large area of land to accomplish, so it counts towards the coverage despite being almost unnoticeable. Which is why some of these requirements are so frustrating. I see why people make their big, star zoos in sandbox with all these settings turned off. There are still a couple of things that I would like to talk about here, and I'm trying to wait until they're on screen so it makes more sense. As close as possible anyway. One thing that we are nearly at is the feeder. I wanted to build a custom feeder that I have seen used at several wildlife centres I've visited in the real world, and I figured out a way to achieve it while also making it usable-ish. I used 2 trees as main supports, as this is something that I've seen quite a bit, and I hid 2 of the hanging feeders inside them, facing inwards as the base of this. I then built the frame of a raised feeding trough out of the thinnest sticks I could find, with the hopes that the moose would be able to reach the feeders inside. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. Which is a shame, but I managed to get it so that the feeding ball, the bit that's hanging, was outside of the bars, so the keepers and the moose could still access it. It means it sticks out at the back, but from the guest perspective at least, they still use it as it was intended, as it was designed. I've tried a few little things like this in the past, and they just don't work for one reason or another, and this, I guess in a way, also doesn't work, but it still looks so good, and it works on a technicality. I don't even care that they're sticking out. It's a touch that makes this whole enclosure feel much more real to me. And, on the whole, I'm actually really happy with how it looks, even though it's a bit busted. I left pretty much the whole construction of the feeder in, as I feel like these are the things we see less often, you know? Sheds, barns, rocks and trees are things in most every episode, so these little elements like this are a little more interesting, at least to me anyway. And they say you should make videos that you would want to watch yourself. The last couple of bits I wanted to mention are coming up in a minute, but they are the bridge and the wall, or the cliffside where the barn is. The bridge I ended up making is as simple as could probably be managed, but it is very fitting. Everything is starting to look a little bit Christmassy at the moment, and that's not helped by the addition of the string lights, but it needed something. The bridge, also, is one of the points where Baby Moose can escape. That's always a factor that catches me at some point, and this was no different. Thankfully, when the first baby did escape, it ran right back in. The guest still ran screaming as if it was a wild lion though. The cliffside is taken from the same reference as the barn design. The barn was set on a raised area that was lined with stacked slate, almost like a man-made brickwork, but embedded in the wall using longer bits of more natural stone. I thought the whole style was really interesting, so I decided to kind of recreate it a bit. It was a little bit tedious if I'm being honest, but the extra detail does help bring another element to the view. Well, if you're still here, you are a true zoo fan, and I hope that you will feel it was worth it when you see it all come together in the cinematics. Still a little bit to go, but we are nearly at the end now, so I will leave you to continue in peace. Let me know if you enjoyed this first episode in this new zoo. I had some really sweet comments recently that have really encouraged me to step my game up, so big thank you to everyone who's watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. Don't forget, stick around to the very end for a little surprise.